All right, well, good morning and welcome back to lesson number 12 in our teaching series, Biblical Theology, the Kingdom Revealed. Last week we looked at the theme of each book of the Old Testament to see how it relates to the other covenant books, to the covenant history, to covenant living. And we did that because it's all about a covenant relationship with God. Today we're going to look at it a little deeper into the structure, the internal structure of the books to start to create a chart of the Bible. How many of you like charts? I love charts. Well, we're going to do a chart of the Hebrew arrangement, then we're going to do a chart of the English arrangement, but today we're going to start with doing a chart of the Hebrew arrangement of the Bible. Now, I need to give credit where credit is due. And the chart that we're going to do is actually an adaptation of a chart done by Dr. Miles Van Pelt. He is a professor of Old Testament and biblical languages, and also the academic dean at the Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Okay. And mentioning credits, some of you might be interested in knowing what resources I'm using for this course. And I do have a handout, which will be the last handout at the last class, which will give you a bibliography of all of the books and courses that I used to formulate this course. Because plagiarism is big, I probably shouldn't say that on the tape. But it's hard to reference everything individually while you're actually teaching the lessons, isn't it? All right, so we're talking about today then the structure of the Bible, God's covenant with man. We saw that the whole Bible is built upon a covenant document. And the Old Testament by itself is structured that way, but the whole Bible is structured that way. In our analogy of the body, what did we say that the structure was like? Do you remember?
The skeleton.
The skeleton, yes, the bones. Exactly. We said it was the bones. It's the thing that gives it shape. It's what makes it identifiable. Okay, we talked about the theological framework. What part of the body was that?
Skin.
The skin. Okay, it holds everything together. And of course, what is the Bible about? It's about the kingdom of God. And the theological center then is, in the body analogy, what part?
Heart.
The heart. Okay, it's what gives life to the book. And of course, the theological center then, the heart of the Bible is who?
Jesus.
Jesus. Okay, so you guys got that down really good. So we've looked at the order of the books. We've looked at the reason why they're arranged in the order that they are. And today what we're going to do is we're actually going to take a CT scan. Okay, we're going to take an X-ray, if you will, of the bones of the Bible. We're going to take an X-ray of the books, and we're going to show how they have an internal structure that actually adds to the large structure of the divisions of the book, which is all that we have really looked at this point. So what should happen now is, it's kind of like that old song, "Dem bones, dem dry bones." Remember? The head bone's connected to the neck bone and so forth, all the way down to the toe bone, and then you come back up again. You know, the image of Ezekiel's dry bones, and God brings through the breath, the Spirit brings them together, and they amalgamate together, and then He breathes life, and He puts skin on them, and gives them a heart, and now you've got this whole person again. Well, that's what we're doing in terms of the metaphor of trying to understand the internal structure. So we're taking an X-ray of the bones, the inner structure. It's like we're taking the skin off to see. And the Bible then should really start coming alive to you. And I'm hoping today that a lot of the stuff that we're going to look at, you've not heard before, and if you have heard it before, you're going to see it in a different light. And I'm hoping that it will give you a whole bunch of aha moments. Oh, I like that. That sounds really cool. Those kinds of things. That's what we're looking for. Ultimately, of course, the goal is so that the Bible becomes really alive to you and you see it as a divine book that God has given to us. So, just so you know exactly where we're going to build a chart of the whole Christian Bible, not just the Old Testament, but of the whole Bible. So the both Old and the New Testament. And to do that, one of the things I'm going to show to you, and we're going to start here, so I'm going to show to you that the New Testament books are also arranged as a covenant document. It's very similar to the Hebrew arrangement. Right? And that's kind of strange because we know that the Old Testament books in our English Bible is arranged totally different. Remember the three criteria? The first is
of the Hebrew ones?
Of the English one. Genre. Okay, so what type of book it is, and then chronology. So they put it in chronological order, and then they take a book that they don't know what to do with, and they just make sure that it goes with the author if he has multiple books. So genre, chronology, and author. But our New Testament in the English Bible is not done that way, and I want to show that to you this morning. If it was arranged by chronology or genre, and even author, then the order of our New Testament books should be Matthew, Mark, John, Luke, Acts. Right? Because Luke wrote Acts. So that you would keep the author together. Or it could be Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, John. Right? If we're going to follow the genre, chronology, author criteria of the book orders. But what about 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and Revelation? Who wrote those books? Well, John, the same John who wrote the Gospel of John. Well, why aren't they all together? Why doesn't Revelation come right after 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John? Why is Jude stuck in between there? Now, these are questions you have to ask in trying to understand the criteria, what's in the mind of the person who compiled it or edited it together in terms of the order that we have. And while there is a different arrangement scheme to the order of our New Testament books from the order of the Old Testament, oh, I said that wrong. There is a different arrangement scheme to the order of our New Testament books from the order of our Old Testament books. And when we get to building the chart for the Old Testament, we'll really see this and see how it actually enhances the chronological order of the English Old Testament later. And so what I'm going to do is it would appear to us that the New Testament is arranged the same as the Hebrew order as a covenant document. And that's kind of cool because God is in His wisdom has made it so that the New Testament can be added to the Hebrew Old Testament. Remember, what's the big problem with Jews today? They cannot accept Jesus nor the New Testament. But if you went to them and said, hey, look, this is also a covenant document, exactly like the Hebrew Old Testament, then they might be more open to understanding it. So God in His wisdom did that for us. But it also fits to our chronology, because if you even follow direct from the chronology of our English Bible, what's the first book in time after Malachi? It would be Matthew. So there is chronology there as well. And we'll see that later. All right, so let's start right now by taking our X-ray picture and bringing up our first three bones, and what's represented by our three boxes. And these are the divisions of the Old Testament. And what are the divisions of the Old Testament in the Hebrew order? They are the law, prophets, and the writings. Okay, sometimes the writings is called the Psalms. And we said the law, the prophets, and the writings, that they tell us about the covenant history, and about covenant life. So we've got those on there as well. Now, if the New Testament books are a covenant document, and I'm going to prove to you that they are, and it's similar to the Old Testament, then there must be a three-section division arrangement as well. And in fact, there is. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put 3 boxes underneath, and we'll call this the New Testament. And for the time being, we're going to call them Gospels, History, and Letters. And you can see that, right? You can understand that. And it's not a whole lot different from the way we have traditionally said that the New Testament is divided. Does all this make sense? Okay, good. So again, I'm going to prove this to you later. Now, every good book, and the Bible is the good book, right? Every good book needs an introduction and a conclusion. Now, a covenant document also has, in terms of it as a document, has an introduction and a conclusion. And so we would expect that it would be also in the Bible. So what we're going to do is right now we're just going to add 2 boxes at each end of it, and we're going to call one the introduction and call the other conclusion. So this is in fact our X-ray of the Bible. Okay, it shows the bones, it shows the structure of how the books, the divisions work together. So I want you to learn this and memorize this so that you can, if you're in a restaurant, somebody says, what's the Bible all about? And you say, well, it's about the kingdom of God and about Jesus, and let me show you how the divisions work. You start to draw this, right? And you'll be able to complete this. Now, I'm going to give you a complete chart after we've done all of the sections, but today we're going to really only talk about the introduction and the conclusion. But how do we know that this is actually the structure? I mean, the law, the prophets, writings, other than from Jesus, that's the only way that we know that the Bible has this threefold breakdown, threefold division, and we only call the New Testaments the Gospels, the History, and the Letters because it just seems to fit if it is in fact a covenant document. So what we're going to do is we want to discover if this arrangement is in fact internally evidenced within the books of the Bible itself, and it is. So what we need to do right off the top is we need to number these boxes. And we're going to start with the number 0. So the box that we call introduction, we're going to call 0. And then 1, 2, 3 across, and then underneath 4, 5, 6, and 7. Now, the reason why we want to number them is 2 reasons. Number 1 is we want the convenience of being able to say, well, let's look at box number 3, or box number 1, or even box number 0. So it's even easier for me to say today we're going to focus on box 0 and box 7, and next week we're going to do boxes 1 to 6. That's a little easier than saying the names, right? Well, but there's another reason, and it is a biblical reason, and that is because what we discover is that this arrangement is actually an arrangement based on the 7 days of creation. And we find this structure throughout the Bible in a lot of places. And we find it focused in on the introduction books and focused in on the conclusion books, which is why we're going to focus on those by themselves today. So Genesis 1:1 to 2:4 is what we call the creation event. And it was written about 1,500 years before the canon of the Bible. Remember we said the canon of the Bible was probably completed by the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So the creation event, in terms of written down that Moses wrote, the book of Genesis, was written about 1,500 years prior to that. So the coincidence of the 7 days of creation becoming the design, the divine design for the structure of the whole Bible is really not a coincidence at all. It is really nothing less than a remarkable design that comes from the Creator. So let's just take a look at the days of creation so that you can see this again. So all I've done now is left the numbers there and the boxes there, and there's the 7 days of creation. Now you're going to say, well, what about the 0? Well, let me show you how this structure follows the days of creation. Genesis 1:1 begins with the statement, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That's not part of day 1. That's an introductory statement isolated by itself, and it says, in the beginning, God. So there was God and nothing else. And this God and nothing else, He created the heavens and the earth out of the nothing else. Ex nihilo. All of this is included here. In fact, the Hebrew word for God is in the plural. So it's even telling us about the Trinity aspect of the Godhead. All in this verse. But it's an introductory statement of the whole creative process. Introducing us to God. And so we're going to label this box 0, God. Because that's all that was there. Then that is followed by the actual 7 days of creation. So on day 1 of creation, what did God do? He separated the light and the darkness. And so there was light and there was darkness. The first day. Right? On day 2, God made the sky and the water. That's kind of cool, isn't it? To have sky and water. The third day, what did He make? Do you remember? You remember? How about the land and the vegetation? Okay? He made all of the land and the vegetation. So there we have the light and darkness, we have sky and water, and we have land and vegetation. But there's no life yet. There's no life yet. So now we come to day 4, and on day 4 He creates the sun, the moon, and the stars. Now what is really cool about this is that on day 1 He creates light and darkness, but on day 4 He creates those things that govern the light and the darkness. Remember, He specifically said that these will divide the day and the night. So there is a parallel structure between box 1 and box 4, or day 1 and day 4. On day 5, what did He create?
Birds and fish.
The birds and the fish. What did He do on day 2? The sky and the water. In fact, the way it's described is it's not birds and fish, but it says the fowl of the air and the fish of the sea. Right? So He's referring back to the day 2, and so we have a parallel there between day 2 and day 5. Then on day 6, of course, He made the animals and He made man. And the animals and man live on the land, and they eat the vegetation. And all of the creatures now have everything they need in order to live. Right? So we have this in the sense of day 1 and day 4 are parallel, day 2 and day 5 are parallel, day 3 and day 6 are parallel, and then it's concluded with day 7, which is the day that God what? The day that God rested. And it's the conclusion of it. In fact, chapter 2, verse 1 begins almost identical to Genesis 1:1, where it says, and God finished, thus the heavens and the earth were finished. So, it's a summary of it all. Now, this is the whole story. And, excuse me. Now, one of the things I want you to notice here, and I'm going to explain the significance of it later, but I want you to see a pattern, a secondary pattern, which is the pattern of 3 and 4. So you see 1, 2, and 3 are the days, and then 4, 5, 6, and 7. Now this pattern of 3 plus 4 shows up in a lot of places in the Bible. And it's always got something to do with God's creativity and with God's rest. And so everything that God does fits within this pattern in some respect. So this is the structure of the Bible. So like the 7 days of creation, where you have God in box 0 and rest in box 7, you move from nothing without form and void to thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and then God rested. So there's a beginning and there is an end. And this is exactly how the storyline of the Bible is worked out. So from creation to the fall to the redemption storyline to Jesus to new creation. That's the entire Bible. And it follows this identically. And what we're going to see is that not only does it follow the 3-4 pattern with an introduction, but it also is that the law, box 1, and the Gospels, box 4, are parallel to each other. And the same as New Testament history and Old Testament history, or the prophets, is parallel. And the writings, the letters of Paul and the general letters are parallel to the writings of the Old Testament. We're going to see that exactly the same way. So that structure of the creation event is the foundation or the pattern to which the entire Bible is based on in terms of its structure as a covenant document. When we use the English Bible as a chronological document, it doesn't fit. But that's okay, and we'll understand why when we get there. So we're looking at it at the Hebrew order and the New Testament order as being covenant documents. So this is our skeleton x-ray. There are 8 bones that give us our structure, and from here we can begin to fill in all our details. So what we're going to do today is we're going to focus in on boxes 0 and box 7. Next time we will do boxes 1 through 6. So box 0 is the introduction, and an introduction tells the reader about the content of the book. It tells the reader what he can expect to find, what's important for them to know in order to fully understand and appreciate the rest of the book. Now, one of the first things that I do when I get a new book is, the very first thing I do is I read the back cover because I want to know who's endorsing it. That's the first thing I do. The second thing I do is I look at the table of contents because I want to know what is coming up. What's kind of the summary. The third thing that I do is I actually read the introduction or the prelude. Is there a prelude is written by somebody other than the author? If there's an introduction, it's written by the author. And what's he doing? He's telling us a little bit about what to expect in the book. And if I'm happy and satisfied with all those points, I'll buy the book. If I'm not, I'll put it back on the shelf. But that's the point here. So you read the introduction of the Bible and you should be able to go, hey, I need to know more, I want to know more, and so you want to keep on reading. That's the purpose of the introduction. Can you think of any book in the Bible that tells the reader what to expect in the rest of the Bible? Can you? Exodus? Leviticus? What?
Genesis.
Genesis. Everybody say that. Genesis. Very good. Okay. Genesis. So we're going to stick that there in the introduction. Now the conclusion. Box 7 is the conclusion, and the conclusion comes after the story, but often wraps up the story in a nicer way, so that we get a concluding ending, a real nice ending. It should offer insight again into what has happened in the rest of the novel. Now, it doesn't need to make everything clear. It's not going to retell the whole story, but it does bring out a summary, so it doesn't need to be crystal clear. And sometimes even a conclusion has a different narrator than the rest of the Bible. Where another character might take it over and tell it from their perspective. So what book in the Bible kind of fits to that description? What do you think? Revelation, exactly. Okay, the book of Revelation. Now, David Trovish, in his book called Paul's Letter Collections, one of the things that he does in this book is he's looking at all of the manuscript evidence. Remember, we talked about the different manuscripts of the Septuagint, which all had orders of the books and so forth, and we find some really weird orders that are there. In fact, if you go back to handout number 7, you'll see them on page 4 of that handout. One of the things that he said is there's all kinds of evidence from all of these manuscripts that when the New Testament had been put together as a canon, so it was complete, that it was distributed not as one book per se, but it was distributed in 4 parts. Hey, that kind of fits to this, boxes 4, 5, 6, 7. But it was, I like it when things agree with me. I say that to Bert all the time. I really like it, this author agrees with me. So he says it was circulated among the believers as in 4 groups. The first group being the Gospels by themselves. That kind of makes sense, right? The second group, this one's a little bit weird, but it's the book of Acts with the general epistles. Okay, so that's James, Peter, John, and Jude. Now, one of the reasons for that, which we'll discover more detail later, is that Peter, James, John, and Jude are part of the original apostles, and in Acts, their ministry were to Jewish Christians. So it makes sense that it goes with Acts. And then the third is all Paul's letters, with Hebrews kind of stuck either between Thessalonians and Timothy, or stuck at the end. And they went together, and then the book of Revelation by itself. It was always treated as a separate book from the others. So there's this actual historical evidence that the book of Revelation was treated separate from the other letters. And that makes sense again, because the book of Revelation in terms of genre is totally different again from any other book in the Bible except possibly Daniel and parts of Ezekiel. And of course, Revelation is a summary of the whole time from the ascension of Christ to the second coming of Christ. So we have Genesis in our introduction and Revelation in our conclusion. Now, one of the things you might be saying to me is, yeah, but Pastor Cliff, how can you really say that Genesis is separate from Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy? I mean, they are the law. That's kind of like the Holy of Holies. You know, you don't touch those 5 books. They go together. So even when we came to the English order, they violated a little bit of their code and kept them together and called it the Pentateuch, the 5 books. Okay, why? Because it's kind of that Holy of Holies mentality. You don't touch these 5 books. But here now, I've separated them. Okay, and I think that we should separate it because I think it should be separated. Is that a good enough reason? No, it's not a good enough reason. So the question is then, is it valid to cut Genesis off from Exodus through Deuteronomy? And my answer is yes. It is valid to do that. Let me explain to you why. Originally, when Moses was sitting down and he was writing those 5 books, he didn't have a computer. He didn't even have a typewriter. All he had was a sharp tool and a slate of rock. And he scratched in the letters, so it was time consuming. And you know, you can't write very tiny. He'll try to get as small as he could. But he's writing on tablets of stone, just like the 10 Commandments were written on tablets of stone. And when he wrote in Hebrew. There were no vowels, there were no punctuation marks, there were no paragraph breaks, there were no spaces between the words. They just wrote letter after letter after letter. So how do you tell word from word and sentence from sentence and paragraph from paragraph and thought from thought? This is what was called in the Latin scriptio continua, which means continuing on and on and on and on. So it's just one long sentence is what it looked like. You know, you just don't play around with spaces when you don't have a lot of material to work with. Okay, so this is how it began. So how did the readers know when the writer wanted a break or was starting a new point? Well, what they would do, what the Hebrews did, is they would use what are called literary devices. Literary devices. Have you heard of literary devices before? Right? Let me give you a few that they might use. The first one that they might use is called an inclusio. And we talked about inclusio a lot in our study of the book of Matthew, because Matthew used them quite a bit, where he would use a phrase here, and then a whole bunch of chapters or verses, and then use identical phrase again. They kind of operate like bookends to isolate and separate. So they would say all of these, this is one complete thought between this statement and this statement, which are identical. That's an inclusio. The other thing that they might do is they might use repetition. And so this would be repetition of words, key words, or it might be repetition of patterns. So the 7 days of creation is a pattern. So if he might start with this 3-4 pattern, and then say a bunch of stuff, and then have another 3-4 pattern. It almost acts the same as bookends, but it's based on repetition. The other literary device that he might use is actually genealogies. And we see this in the book of Genesis, where it talks about this is the genealogy of Adam, this is the genealogy of Seth, this is the genealogy of, and so forth. Okay, so it's creating these breaks so that everything between those genealogies is one thought, and everything after is a new thought until the next genealogy. Another literary device is called the type scene. Has anybody ever heard of a type scene before? You want to know what it is? Okay, a type scene is a repeated scene. Right? So lots of times when you're watching movies, you'll see a scene is set up, and then we change scenes and they go to something else, and then all of a sudden they're back to another scene which seems to be similar or almost identical to that first scene. That's called a type scene. It's trying to draw parallels between those events. So for instance, here's a type scene in the Bible. It says to us, Abraham went down to Egypt. So we have a scene where he's going into Egypt. Now, he does something stupid when he's there, but the point is he goes down into Egypt. Well, by itself, that's nothing, except that as we're reading along, we also discover that Jacob goes down into Egypt. The stupid guy did the same thing as Abraham. Okay? But then later on, Joseph goes down into Egypt. Then Moses goes down into Egypt. And even when we come into the New Testament, it says that Jesus went down into Egypt. So we have this type scene, this scene of going down into Egypt, and it becomes a picture of with meaning to it. So going down into Egypt is a picture of going into exile or going into slavery. Okay, we also have a type scene where they come out of Egypt, and if going into Egypt is going into slavery and going into exile, what would coming out of Egypt be? Yeah, it's the picture of Exodus or of salvation, being saved from that kind of slavery. So that's a type scene. Another type scene is getting a wife at a well. It seems that back in the biblical days, particularly the Old Testament, that going to the well is what, honey?
Just taking my notes.
Oh, okay, I don't need them, so we'll give it to Dad. Thank you. It would seem that in the Old Testament times that the singles bar was the well. So getting a wife at the well is a type scene. Eliezer, Abraham's servant, Abraham said, go find a wife for my son Isaac, and so he goes to a well, and he finds his wife. Jacob goes to a well, and who does he see? Whoa, there's Leah and Rachel. And of course, they both ended up being his wife. Moses goes to a well, and who does he see? His wife. See, they go to a well and they find a wife. That's a type scene. I wonder what the disciples thought when they saw Jesus at the well talking about marriage to the Samaritan woman. Anyways, it's a type scene. So the most popular literary device, and the one that actually becomes the internal evidence for us in terms of the structure of the Bible, is a big poem. Now, poetry is used a lot, but In fact, if you go through the first 11 chapters of Genesis, you'll discover these little poems that actually create literary breaks. But then, all of a sudden, you come to this great big poem. And you wonder, whoa, what is that all about? And then you're reading Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and again you have these little poems and a little bit bigger poems, but all of a sudden you come to this another great big poem, and then you discover that, hey, the big poem over this part is identical to the big poem over this part, and what happens after the big poems in both parts is identical or parallel. So let me show you what I mean by this. And how it actually makes the point. Now, again, what we're trying to think about here is a literary device that makes a break. Because we're trying to understand that we can separate Genesis from Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy as being an introductory by itself, even though it's part of the 5 books of the law. So when you have a musical, for instance, like the movie Singing in the Rain, or Sound of Music, how do they change scenes? What do? They put in a big song and dance number, don't they? And the song and dance number kind of summarizes what went on, and then they fade out into a new scene and they start over again. And that's what this big poem does, is it identifies, they change of points, change of scenery. So watch this. In the book of Genesis, it begins with, in chapter 1, the birth of Adam, right? In chapter 1 of Genesis. And then we go all the way through to chapter 49, where we have this big poem. And in this big poem, Jacob, who's now called Israel, he blesses his 12 sons. Right? Great big poem, the blessing of his 12 sons. And right after this, chapter 50, the last book of the book of Genesis, Jacob dies. The patriarch dies. So, the patriarch blesses his 12 sons, then the patriarch dies. Great big poem. An obvious grammatical, literary change in terms of what had come before. So it makes you think about it. Well, now look at this. Exodus begins with the birth of Moses, right? In chapter 2. And you're going along and you have Moses 40 days, 40 years in Egypt and 40 years in the desert, and then he goes back and says 40 years in the wilderness and so on. And then all of a sudden we get to the book of Deuteronomy. Everything's kind of the same. It's his ministry all in the middle there. Then all of a sudden in the book of Deuteronomy, we come to Deuteronomy chapter 33. And what happens? Great big poem. And this is Moses in this great big poem. He's blessing the 12 tribes of Israel. It's parallel to Genesis 49. He's blessing the 12 tribes of Israel. And then the very next chapter, what happens? Moses dies. It's identical, very parallel. So this is a literary structure, an internal structure in the book that tells us that there is a difference between Genesis and the rest of the books. So it gives us this internal break. So part 1 is the book of Genesis on its own, and part 2 is Exodus through Deuteronomy. Okay, and when you actually begin to study the content, you see that, yeah, there is. Genesis is totally different. In fact, it's the setup for everything that happens in Exodus to Deuteronomy. Exodus to Deuteronomy really is the content of the books of the law, the covenant books. So this is internal structure. So now what about that? And gives us the freedom to separate Genesis from the other books and call it an introduction to this first section. What about the book of Revelation? And we've already talked about the manuscript evidence of how Revelation is distributed as a separate book, but is there anything else? Well, there is. And what I'm going to do in this next, the rest of our lesson is we're going to look at, I believe, four. We're going to look at 4 other types of devices that are used to show how Genesis and Revelation are treated as an introduction and conclusion separate from the rest of the Bible. All right, sound like a way to go? All right. Well, it's the only way we're going, so you might as well follow me along. All right, so the fact that both Revelation and Genesis have other similar forms of structure unique to both is evidence that they are the covenant introduction and the covenant conclusion. So the first thing that we're going to look at is we're going to come back to the pattern of 7 again, the 7 days of creation. So point 1 is the pattern of 7. This is where we're going to deviate a little bit from the numbering that's in your notes. So now the first thing we're looking at is the pattern of 7, or the 7 days of creation. So let me show you how this works again. Genesis 1:1 we already saw as an introduction, and then it's followed by 3 parallel days, 3 days and then 3 parallel days, and then the 7th day, which is the conclusion. So the book of Revelation has this pattern of 7s as well. Where am I here? Oh yeah. I'm showing there Genesis. So Genesis has the 7 days. Okay, here we go. Revelation. The book of Revelation also has this pattern of 7s. So we already saw it in Genesis. But this pattern of the 7 days of creation. At the beginning of the book of Revelation, we're introduced to the Son of Man, the Son of God, in heaven with a 7-sealed book and 7 angels. Right? So this is the number 7 being repeated over and over again. Then he opens the first seal, and then he opens the second seal, then he opens the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th seal. So you have, again, this pattern. You see this? And then what do you think he does after this 6th seal? He opens the 7th seal. That's kind of neat, isn't it? He opens the 7th seal. Now what's really interesting about this, in this pattern structure of these seals, is that the 7th seal is a description of the second coming of Christ. So it's the finality, it's the conclusion. But this isn't the only pattern of the 7 in the book of Revelation, because what else do we find? We find that there's 7 trumpets that follow the exact same thing. And the 7th trumpet is the second coming. But that's not the only one. The book of Revelation also has the 7 bowls. And so you have them following each other, and guess what the 7th bowl is all about? The second coming. You see, so it's always this introduction followed by this conclusion. And so we have this pattern of 7 in the book of Revelation, which helps us to understand, hey, this is different from any other book, because we don't see this pattern repeated with this kind of structure in any other book of the Bible. And so the second thing, so that's the pattern of 7. The second thing that we want to look at is, in fact, the outline of the books. So if we come back to the book of Genesis here for a second, the first thing that we notice is the word Genesis means, do you know what it means? Can you read? It means beginning. Well, that's kind of cool when we're looking at Genesis as being the introduction. It means beginning. Don't you think that's cool? Is that an aha moment? Oh. That kind of makes a lot of sense. Well, wait till you see this now. The entire book from Genesis 1 to Genesis 50 breaks down into 7 parts, and it's all done by grammar. All right, so let me show you the 7-fold thing. So in chapter 1 and 2, we have the creation event, and they're in the Garden of Eden. Okay, chapter 3, we have the fall. They're kicked out of the garden. Okay, it's a separate event. 3 to 6, the fall and its aftermath. Then then we have Noah in chapter 6 to 9. Then we have Babel in chapters 10 to 11. Okay, and these 3 are events. Okay, so now remember the 3-4 structure I talked about? 4, 5, 6, and 7 are going to be slightly different, and they are. There's no longer events, but they're people, because 4, 5, 6, and 7 are about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. The really cool thing here is you got to ask yourself, well, why Joseph? He's not one of the patriarchs. He wasn't given the the covenant promise. So remember, I kind of isolated this in our Psalm 33 that we read earlier this morning. What did I say? What was the famine that they were talking about? This is the end of box 6. Jacob, there's a famine. The family, the people of God, are facing possible death and annihilation and being wiped out, which would end the promises of God, which would mean there are no people of God, there is no elect, there's nothing going to happen. So who's going to save them? In comes Joseph. And Joseph gets him into Egypt, and God says, I took them to Egypt to prosper and rest. Wow. There's that concept again of the seventh day of creation where God is bringing rest. So Joseph is actually a picture of Jesus in bringing salvation to the possible wipeout of the people that God has chosen to be his people. And so that's that same pattern. And that's the whole book of Genesis. So it follows this pattern as well, but it follows it as part of the introduction. I think this is really cool. And it's really neat that they begin in Eden, they get kicked out, and they end up in Egypt where everything is great. Life is fabulous, of course, until the new Pharaoh comes along, right? And then we start the pattern all over again. So we have the pattern of sevens in the creation account. We have the pattern of sevens in the seals, trumpets, and bowls of Revelation. We have the sevenfold outline of Genesis. And we also have the sevenfold outline of the book of Revelation. Now, who would have thought that, eh? So when we come to the book of Revelation, which, by the way, the word for Revelation is apocalypsis. Apocalypsis. Okay, and where Genesis means beginning, apocalypsis means revealing, but it implies the revealing of the end. Because what is the apocalypse? The apocalypse is the cataclysmic destruction of evil. And what does it mark? The end of what? This age and the beginning of the age to come. Remember, we've already talked about that? That's the apocalypse. That's what we're looking for. We want our enemies destroyed. And the whole new heaven and new earth is a picture of perfection without any death, without any disease, without any problems, without any enemies. You see. So the enemy has to be taken care of. Well, that's what that. When does that happen? At the beginning? In the middle? When does it happen? At the end, exactly. So again, so the sevenfold structures. How does the book of Revelation divide in 7 parts? Again, we have grammatical indicators that tell us where these breaks come. So chapters 1 to 3, we have the letters to the 7 churches. Okay? And then we have the 7 seals in chapters 4 to 8, which is followed by the 7 trumpets in chapters 8 to 11. That makes sense, right? Okay, well, we get a little bit of a diversion here because now God's going to talk about the same period of time, but with different words. And in chapters 12 to 14, it's the war with the dragon. Okay, and he has his 2 beasts that help him, right? But ultimately it ends in their destruction. And then in the 4th part is the 7 bowls, chapters 15 to 16. Chapter 5 is the fall of Babylon, chapters 17 to 19. And then the next part is the fall of Satan in chapter 20. Now what do you know here? Notice here about the 3 and 4 structure again. So you have the seals, the trumpets, and the war. But then you have the bowls, the fall of Babylon, and the fall of Satan. So everything now is, the first 3 are overviews of the time spectrum, specifically how it affects the people of God. And then the bowls, the fall of Babylon, and the fall of Satan is how God is going to deal with his enemies and ultimately bring them to their final destruction. And of course, then what happens at the end? Chapters 21 and 22, what do we have? We have the new age to come, the new heaven and the new earth, the final rest. You see that? Isn't that amazing? You like this? This is really cool. And when you realize that Revelation follows the same pattern, and Genesis follows this same pattern, it saves you again from making a lot of end-time theology mistakes. Okay? Because a lot of, in fact, the popular teaching today in terms of end times messes this up so much that And because it won't follow the pattern. It wants to make things go where they shouldn't go. But if they would follow God's pattern, they would find that it really makes a lot of sense. Okay, you know, one of the really interesting things about this is Revelation begins with Jesus in heaven, so it's right at the time of his ascension, and then it ends at his second coming, where he brings in the eternal rest. And that's what it's all about. The whole timeline of the book of Revelation covers from Jesus' ascension to his return. And we're right in the middle in terms of history, aren't we? Or maybe we're more toward, who knows where we are? And does it really matter? It doesn't really matter. All right, let me ask you this. Just a little bit of an aside, which is something that I found really interesting. How many of you have heard of the word eschatology? Okay, so what is eschatology? It's the study of what? Yeah, it's the study of the end. It's what we talk about when we want to talk about prophetic things. We say this is eschatology. It sounds cool to say eschatology over prophecy. Doesn't it? No, okay. Maybe I'm just weird. I don't know. How many of you have heard of the word protology as a field of theology? See, that was new, isn't it? What do you think it's about? The study of what? What was that, Justin?
The beginning.
The beginning, exactly. It's the study of the beginning. That's kind of cool. It's all about origins and first things. Eschatology, about final events and last things. Protology, origins and first things. And where would you put the book of Genesis? Protology. Where would you put the book of Revelation? Eschatology, the beginning and the end, the introduction and the conclusion. You see how even theologically, in terms of its content, it separates them from the rest of the books of the Bible. So that there's lots of internal evidence in its structure where we can make these conclusions that Genesis is separate and needs to be treated differently from the other 4 books of the law, even though it's still part of the law, and Revelation is to be treated separately from the other letters, even though it's really still part of the letters. It's written by the Apostle John. All right, let me bring you to the third thing. So the first thing was the pattern of sevens, the second was the book outlines, and the third thing is a literary device known as chiasm. Now, I've talked about that before. How many have know what this means? Okay, it comes from the Greek letter chi, which looks like a big X. And it's funny that they use this word to illustrate it, because it really only illustrates it in half of the X, not the whole X. What a chiasm is it's a sequence of ideas that are presented one way and then repeated, but in the reverse order. So you have points A, B, C, D, and then it's repeated again, D, C, B, A. I can't, anyway. So the result is you get this mirror effect of the ideas where they're reflecting backwards. Now, because they kind of go this way and then this way, the first part of the X, it forms an arrowhead. So oftentimes, the chiasm will actually have an X in between them. So you might go A, B, C, X, and then C, B, A, so that it's reflecting it back. But because it's like an arrowhead, it's pointing down. Well, let me show it to you like this. See, there's the X. It's like an arrowhead that's pointing and focusing on the X, so that the X becomes the focal point of what the A and B are talking about. Okay, and so because of this chiasm structure, it helps you to focus on the middle point. And when we give lectures, when I preach a sermon, a 3-point sermon, if I ever preach a 3-point sermon, if I ever did preach a 3-point sermon, okay, then point 3 is the focal point. Okay, but in Hebrew and Greek thinking, the focal point is not even the points. The focal point is what they point to. Do you follow that? Good. All right. So the books of Genesis and Revelation, they reflect a chiasm together. So that Genesis is the first part and Revelation is the second part of this ABBA structure. The X would be all the books from Exodus through to Jude that fall in between. So let me show you how this works. In Genesis 1 and 2, what's it all about again? What's Genesis 1 and 2 all about?
Creation.
Creation, exactly. So creation then is the first idea that is presented in Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 2 ends by telling us about the creation of the woman and how he brought Adam and Eve together and they united as man and wife. So we have the creation event, then we're introduced to the concept of marriage at the end of chapter 2. So that's point number 2. A is creation, B is marriage. Chapter 3 opens up and all of a sudden we have this snake. Okay, we're introduced to Satan in chapter 3 and we have the promise that this snake is going to be destroyed, that his head is going to be crushed. So Genesis 1 to 3 go creation, marriage, Satan. The promise that Satan will be, he's going down. When we come to Revelation then, and this is the first 3 books of the whole Bible. Let's now go to the last 3 chapters of the whole Bible. First 3 chapters, last 3 chapters to get this form of chiasm. So Genesis chapter 22 describes, Revelation chapter 22, thank you, describes for us the garden that the river, the tree, the fruit, exactly the same as Genesis chapter 1 and the first part of 2. So and that's the end of the book. And then we have in chapter 21, it's called the marriage of the Lamb. It's talking about the bride and the Lamb coming together. And so that's point 3. And then Revelation 20 is how it ends. Okay? It ends with the destruction of Satan. I mean, that dude is smoked permanently. He's totally destroyed. So in Genesis 3, you have the promise of his ultimate destruction. In Revelation 20, the promise is fulfilled. Now look at this. So we have in Genesis, we have creation, marriage, Satan. Then in Revelation, we have Satan, marriage, creation. So it's a mirror effect. It's the true chiasm in its reverse order. And in Revelation is not just one of the defeats of Satan, because the rest of the earlier chapters of Revelation talk about different defeats of Satan. It's not talking about those. It's talking about the ultimate destruction. The guy has ultimately come to his end. He's sent into the lake of eternal fire, never more to appear or give us any kind of problem. And it's not just any marriage that it's talking about. It's talking about the ultimate marriage. This is the climax, the antitype of what all marriages are the picture of. And it's not just any garden that it's talking about. It's the final, the perfect, the greatest, the never-ending, the never-corrupted garden and new creation that God has. So he started with creation as the pattern. The pattern was destroyed, and now it has been renewed. So Genesis and Revelation, they begin and end in reverse order. And when we get to Revelation, what do we know? What do we know? We know that we're done. It's over. It's finished. Isn't that kind of cool? So that's how the structure of the Bible works together. Let me give you, I've got time. I had put an option here, but I think I've got time for this. Let me give you a fourth evidence of this internal structure, again, that points to this beginning and end. And again, it involves Genesis and Revelation as an eternal, and it's the use of symbolic numbers. Do you know that there are numbers in the Bible that are called symbolic numbers? Okay, all right. One of the problems with symbolic numbers is a lot of people out there want to make a whole bunch of numbers symbolic numbers. and they add a whole pile of stuff that just really makes the thing silly. When it comes right down to it, there's really only a very small number. And the most important ones are 3, 7, 10, and 12. Those are the most important ones in terms of symbolic numbers. So let me show you how this works. Now, any other number that's a multiple of those, they have to be broken down into those smaller numbers in order to understand the symbolism and the meaning behind it. And I'll explain that as we go here. In Genesis, again, in Genesis chapter 12 and in chapter 15, we have the promise of God to Abraham that he was going to give them descendants who would number the stars of the sky. That's a big part. Can you count the number of stars? Are there 1,000? 10,000? Million? More, right? There's such a big number we can't count it. Well, that's what God's promise is to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. And that's a pretty amazing promise when you think about it, because the time that he gave that, Abraham didn't have any children, and his wife Sarah was barren. So it's really going to show how God works in miraculous ways to bring this about. But then, of course, Isaac is born, and Isaac then has a son, Jacob, and Jacob has how many sons? 12 sons. So that's kind of cool. And so in Genesis, then, it begins with 12. And this is one of the symbolic numbers. In fact, it's right here that it begins its first picture of what it stands for. The number 12 stands for family or a household. So, and again, the symbolism, the children of Israel, the 12 tribes, is a picture, a type of the people of God. Remember, we're talking about the kingdom of God, God's people in God's place under God's rule, right? So the 12 tribes is a picture, a type of the antitype, which is the people of God. And that's what the number 12. So 12 has to do with the family of God. So here in Genesis, we begin with 12. Well, the 12 grow to 70, and this is when they end up in Egypt. Okay, and then at the time of the Exodus, they're almost 2 million. When they come out, that whole generation dies off before they ever get to go into the promised land. But it's replicated itself, so we're still about 2 million when we go into the promised land. And then by the time of David and Solomon, the nation has become so huge that they're one of the most revered nations in the area. And they're experiencing a real time of peace and rest, and things are going really great. And that's when David says, hey, I want to build a permanent structure. And Solomon then builds the temple for God in Jerusalem. Everything's great, right? Everything's fabulous. Well, what happens? Well, Solomon rejects God. Things turn into a mess. The nation divides. The Assyrians come in and they wipe out 10 of the 12 tribes. Wow. Then Babylon comes and he takes the last tribe of Judah into captivity. They're into exile. And then finally, after 70 years, Cyrus, the Persian leader, he says, you can go back to your land. And but only a small portion of them decide to go back to Jerusalem. And over 70 years or so, they rebuild the walls and they rebuild the temple. It's not very good. And there they are, this little tiny country that is still under the control of a foreign nation. That's not very big, is it? But then one of the things that we learned again through progressive revelation is that it never was about the national Israel. It never was about that. The people of God is not, they're only a type, a picture, a shadow. The 12 tribes is to represent the beginnings of God building his own people as a people of faith, as the descendants of Abraham. So that, yeah, physically, they might have gone from a huge nation of millions of people all the way down to a really tiny group of people who are still under subversion of a foreign enemy. But God's people through that whole time They've been people of faith who've been saved and saved. And not just Jews. Rahab, who a Gentile, Ruth, a Gentile, a whole bunch of other Gentiles that have been saved through faith because of the witness of God through the unfaithfulness of Israel. And all the way up till today, so you and I are part of the family of God. We are part of the descendants of Abraham by faith. We are included in this 12, so to speak, in terms of its symbolism. We are the people of God. We're the family of God. We're growing and growing. And how many Christians do you think have been now since the days of Abraham? A lot, right? 1,000? 2,000? More, right? Okay. Get to see that where we're going to get to the number of the stars. So, starting Genesis with 12, how many show up? How many are described at the end in the book of Revelation? Do you know? Yeah, 144,000. Woohoo! We made it. This is the end. There's 144,000 people of God. Amen. There's something wrong here. Okay? What's wrong is that's not a literal number. That is a symbolic number, because what is 144,000 made up of? It's made up of 12 times 12 times 1,000. Now, 1,000 is not a symbolic number, but it is a multiple of 10, which is a symbolic number. So that is, so when we put it down, 144,000 really is 12 times 12 times 10 times 10 times 10. And this is where we understand the meaning. We need to know this. So in Genesis, we're starting with 12 people. In Revelation, we're ending with 144,000, but that's not a literal 144,000. That is symbolic of the complete family of God by being 12 times 12 times 10 times 10 times 10. Let me explain what I mean here. The number 12 again is the number of the family. It means, where am I here? It's talking about the people of God. So there's 12 tribes, 12 patriarchs, 12 disciples. The kingdom of heaven itself is described as having 12 gates, 12 foundations, 12 jewels, the 12 names of the tribes, 12 names of the apostles. The dimensions of it are square, and it's all multiples of 12. Everything is 12 because 12, 12, 12, 12, 12, it's all of the family. Is 12 times 12 is 12 the whole times the whole, which means it is the entirety of the family of God. That's what 12 times 12 means. The entire family of God. You cannot get a bigger number symbolically than 12 times 12 unless you multiply it by 10. And the number 10 is the symbol of total completion. There are three numbers that talk about completion. The number 3, and it's talking about completion in terms of 3 is also the Trinity. It's talking about completion in terms of the relationship, in terms of relationships. So it's a complete relationship. 3, the Trinity, is a complete relationship. And then you have 7, which really is not the number of God. We've heard people say that it's not the number for God. It's the number of perfection, but it's complete perfection. So whenever you see anything as 7, it's a complete perfection. So the 7 days of creation again, 7. How did God pronounce His creation on day 7? Said it was perfect. It was good. But not just good, it was very good. After He created the woman, of course. Right? It was very, very good. And so it's the number of perfection. So it's a complete perfection. But 10 is now talking about total completeness and can be applied to anything. So when you apply 10 to 12, it's talking about the complete family. And what is the biggest number that you can get in terms of completion? 10 times 10 times 10. 1,000. So when it says 12 times 12, it says we're talking about the whole family. The entire thing from beginning to end. And when it's talking about 10 times 10 times 10, it's talking about, hey, that's 3. 3 is the picture of God. So it's God's total family. The redemption of God's people is complete, is what it's saying. It's not talking about a literal number. 144,000 is hardly a description of Abraham. Your descendants will be the number of the stars in the sky. 144,000, that doesn't fit at all. The JWs really got this all wrong, don't they? Anyway, so it's talking about the redemption of God's people is complete. And the biggest number that you can get in terms of the symbolism is 144,000. You can't get a bigger number. And this is the complete number of the founding. So it's telling us that the promise to Abraham is fulfilled, that it is represented by the number 144,000. Okay? Every person that the Father has given to Jesus, the Son, has come to him. All of the sheep have come into the fold. The last person to be saved has been saved. Everything that God set out to do, all of the people that he set out to find and bring into his fold, they're there. It's complete. It's done. No more. No other person to be added. It is the E-N-D. It's the end. By the way, just kind of as an aside, Revelation 20 talks about the millennium. What number is that? 1,000. 1,000 is a multiple of the symbol number 10 times 10 times 10. 3 tens. Completeness. Millennial time. It's talking about God's complete time. The Revelation starts with the ascension, ends with the second coming. The complete time from Christ's ascension to his ending is described as 1,000 years. Is it literal? No. It's saying it's complete. God is finished with this time, the period of time and what is it talking about? The chapter says Satan's bound at the beginning, Satan's destroyed at the end. So it's the complete time when God makes his enemies his footstool from the cross to the lake of fire. All right, well, that's boxes 0 to 7. The introduction and the conclusion. Next week we're going to continue with boxes 1 and 4 and see how they work together. And hopefully we'll be able to do 2 and 5 as well as 3 and 6. It's not quite as involved as this one, but we'll get similar types of wow moments. So, friends, what does this teach us about God? What does it teach us about God? I think there's 5 things that it teaches us about God. The first is that he is a divine architect. You can just see that in the structures. I mean, you look at the time involved between all of these writings and how everything lines up the same. It's not different. Revelation is exact same structure as Genesis, yet there's all of this time in between. He's a divine architect. The second thing that it does is it proves his existence, because no man could do this. It's impossible for any man to have been able to lay out the Bible to have this kind of structure. So that all 66 books have that same structure that Genesis has and Revelation has and that the days of creation have. You just can't get that anywhere else. So it proves that God's existence. The third thing is it guarantees that his plan for the redemption of the world will be completed. If we can see the existence of the design and the structure and the completion of the plan up to date, then what is there for us to believe about the future? That it might happen? It will happen. See? It guarantees that it will happen. So that strengthens our hope. The fourth thing is that his steadfast loyalty and his faithfulness to his promise and his elect. It just shouts out God's character, that he is faithful. He's going to do everything that he said he did. He does not lie. And that means we can trust everything that he ever says to us. We can trust him in every circumstance. We don't need to understand all of the reasons why something happens. We need to be like Job and learn in the sovereignty of God and the providence of God, where he works out his plan. And all of that is based on the fact that he is steadfastly loyal to his word and to us as his elect people. He will save his people. He will prepare their place for them to be. He will put them under his rule where they will be blessed. And the fifth thing that we learn from this is that it gives us confidence and unwavering hope for the future. If there's any doubt at all that God exists and that God's word is real, what did I say? Is there any? So I'm going to say the negative now. I'm going to say, if you have any doubt at all in God and his word, this debunks it all. That's what I want to say. It gives us the confidence and the unwavering hope. And you know what that does? For Declan and Brianna and Isaac and Aurora and Noah and Ezra. What does it do for them? It's going to keep them in the church. Because you're going to keep teaching this to them. You're going to pass it on to them. They're going to learn that, hey, this is a book that's got answers. It's a book that's got real history. Not only real history in the past, but real history in the future. That's kind of cool. We know how it's going to end. And that's what it's all about. All right. Are there any questions? Any questions at all? All right, let's pray then. Father, thank you again for the way you have designed your word in such a way that it really blows our minds when we think about it. And it helps us to understand again, Lord, just how much of a divine architect you are and how great you are to be able to put this together. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. It's awesome. And Lord, we just worship you today that it gives us the hope, it gives us understanding into your character. It helps us to know that we can trust you. It helps us to know that there are answers and they're in your word, to know that everything is taken care of. And we don't, in spite of our circumstances, that we can trust you in everything. And we don't need to always know the why, because we know the who. And we just thank you, Lord, today. We pray for all of our children as they grow up, that they will learn to trust your word as you have presented it, and to trust in the Lord Jesus Christ, so that they too will become part of that family of God, to be part of the complete picture, to enter into eternity, into the new heaven and the new earth. And we thank you in Jesus' name.